Peace and love, family. This video is going to talk to you about the composition of water, how water forms together through bonds, through chemical bonds, and how those chemical bonds affect us daily in our life, whether it's mentally, or whether it's physically. Okay, so just kind of follow along, and I'm going to do a comparison of how the structure of water and it bonding to each other, how it basically relates to our life and everyday life, how we interact with each other, how it changes our mood and our behavior. Just not to hold no without further ado, I'm going to get into it. Bonds are the most important part of understanding our life and relationship with others in the world. Bonds are formed through a chemical transaction between two atoms or more, and being that we are all organic molecules of atoms sharing an experience on this world, it is important that we understand the nature of the mechanics that brings us closer together. See, we often struggle with our identity because we do not know the nature of our bonds and the natural chemistry that forms them. There are many types of bonds, and their causes and effects are different based on the chemical transaction that takes place. The chemical transaction can be a response of how we interact in our relationships to one another and the world around us. See, we often think of water as just a liquid fluid that flows, but the molecule of H2O has such a larger role in our life. The molecule of H2O sticks our DNA structures together. It bonds us to one another and has the ability to translate history across the world. And what I mean by translate history, meaning that since this water has been around since the beginning of time and water has consciousness, water helps to evolve us as man and woman. Okay? So it actually helps to translate and encourage us to evolve. A baby starts out between 80 to 90% water. Then children, it drops to 70%. And as adult, it ranges from 60 to 65%. Water explains the disconnection between the youth and the elderly. The importance of how we actually bond with our children is through the connection of water. See, when we age, our body has less water in it because the perception of water decreases over the time span, and we drink less of it, causing our skin to wrinkle and our brain to shrink, which leads to the distant behaviors that are associated with the elderly. Lack of water forms conditions like dementia, Alzheimer's, and other types of mental health issues due to the shrinking of the brain from the lack of water thereof. After all, your brain is only 85% water, henceforth the term waterhead. But chronic diseases are the signal for dehydration in the body. So when the siren is not attended to or the call is not answered, this will cause great problems for anybody in a health condition. Water transmits waves of energy, so it's felt from one being to the next. Water can hold and share many types of expressions, and through a better understanding will help us to become even more closer with the element that exists solely as a molecule to form bonds of life. The greatest solvent on earth is water, and when it's combined with a substance, it makes it a universal solution to many of our problems that exist today. The Creator gave it to us in abundance so that we may have a solution to many of the problems we face, but because the majority of us only understand the basics of water, we fall victim due to the circumstances of those who do, which affects our chemical makeup. There is nothing new under the sun. Our people will be destroyed for the lack of knowledge. So we must first learn the basics of what it is so we can further understand how something that makes up majority of our world and body controls who we are in society, our relationship with other people, and how to interact with the environment around us. The information presented will be about water as we know it and how its chemical bonds shape the health of our mind, body, life, and relationships. In order for water to become a molecule, it takes a special bond between one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms. And I know everybody already knows this, but know that how this takes place shapes our entire understanding of existence. See, we are all organic molecules of atoms that forms bonds with one another, and an atom wants to fulfill this octet by bonding with another atom to make it complete. So you may ask yourself, what's an octet? In order to understand the nature of the physical being, you must first know something about the level before it. So before we came to be, and to know our psychology and our physical makeup of who we are, we must first know something about chemistry and the chemical bonding of elements taking place to form our structure. Water is formed on the elements of hydrogen and oxygen on the elements chart. Each element on the chart is trying to transition to the far right side to become a noble gas. Noble gases are complete elements, meaning that they possess a full octet on its outer shell, which stabilizes the structure, making it complete in itself. Okay? So all other elements must bond together by either sharing, donating, or eliminating an electron with another element. So if you look at our chart, you have hydrogen that's at the top left corner, and you have the far right side where you have all the noble gases in gold. Okay, noble gases, they're talking about, when we talk about the atomic number, the atomic numbers 2, 10, 18, 36, those are the atomic numbers. And now you can see oxygen has the number 8. Okay, so this is what's going to play relevant for hydrogen, because it has 1 and it has 2. You need 2 hydrogen atoms to actually connect with oxygen for it to feel more like neon, which is 10, and it gets to the feeling of being like a noble gas. Every atom has protons, neutrons, and electrons. The atom starts out neutral with an even amount of protons and electrons. The protons and neutrons are located in the nucleus, which is the center of the atom, which holds the density/weight and carries a positive charge because of the number of protons. The neutrons do not carry a charge. The neutralizing charge comes from the electrons, which can be the same number as protons. Okay? So if you're looking at this structure, or even in the chart below that says atoms, you can see what an oxygen atom looks like. Okay, oxygen has 6 on its outside shell. Okay, it's a complete number of 8 on the inside and outside, but we're mainly talking about the outer shell. Okay, the valence shell. All right, and this is the number. These are what atoms and elements are looking at transitioning, is that outer shell. Okay, for completion of 8. All right, so now this is where it gets sticky. The electrons orbit around the atom, known as an electron orbital shell or a valence shell. This carries the same number of electrons to neutralize the atom's positive charge nucleus, but the outermost shell of the atom is looking to be stable, so it must get to the number of 8 for its shell to be whole, kind of like a pizza when you have 8 slices to a pie. This is known as the octet rule, whereas electrons want to become a noble gas which has the number of 8 electrons in its outermost shell. An atom is unstable without the 8 electrons, so it is willing to bond together with other atoms to help them to become stable by getting to the number of completion being 8. What I mean is that a single oxygen atom is lonely and unstable by itself, because there are only 6 electrons in its outermost shell, and every atom is looking to pair up, to bond, and be complete. So it combines with a pair of hydrogen atoms, because each one of them carry 1 electron apiece. Now you have a molecule of water through a chemical bond. Our reality is that we are all atoms that are looking for someone to bond with to complete our electron shell to feel complete in the grand scheme of things. After all, we're just a microcosm of the universe. Atoms want to make their electron orbital / house complete by fulfilling what it needs most, or what it can do better without. See, if we look at our life from the perspective of an atom, we will know that we share the same journey of transitioning through our life, creating different bonding experiences in order to fulfill our octet to become a noble being. Look at it this way. We all start out as a positive core, center / nucleus, and through our experiences with the environment shapes our outlook on life and how we feel inside. You cannot have a negative outlook on life without a negative experience. Negativity is a behavior learned along the journey through different bonding experiences, but with this, it brings great value to how you transition through life based on the experiences of knowing what's negative, gives a true definition and appreciation to what's positive. After all, contrast defines the art of living. Our journey begins when we are separated from our mother's primordial waters. This feeling of oneness sets us out on a journey to look for something or someone to provide that noble feeling of wholeness again. Every living organism is made of atoms and spends its life transitioning through a connection of different bonds, looking for what it takes to make it complete or make it whole. So we are all on a destiny to become one mind and one sound and one body. And for that to happen, it takes the shape of many different bonds, many different bonding experiences that we actually transition through in life. So let me explain how they do so through the chemistry of bonds. Chemistry is defined as a branch of science that deals with the identification of the substance of which matter is composed, their properties and the ways in which they interact, combine, and change, and those use of these processes to form new substances. It also is defined as the complex emotional or psychological interaction between two people. So everything in life involves chemistry, as we was talking about the elements and how the chemistry of bonds is about making and breaking of bonds, and this is what water does. Okay, so the chemistry and the chemical aspect of how water bonds affects our lives, all right, emotionally and psychologically. Okay, because we are mostly made up of water, the nature of the chemical structure affects our lives, and through the principles of the chemical bonds will explain the nature of how we bond together in our relationships to one another as well as the world around us, because after all, we are mostly composed of water. So because we're mostly composed of water, I'm going to explain to you how does the two become one. Water bonds start with the joining of two different atoms known as a covalent bond. See, a covalent bond forms between an oxygen atom and two different hydrogen atoms. The oxygen is naturally bigger than the hydrogen. Okay, so I'm going to draw up here now. You have the oxygen, okay? And you have your two hydrogen, okay? Put a hydrogen, oxygen, okay? We're going to put these dots as okay, these are your electrons, okay? So once again, as you can see right here, oxygen has a total number of 6 on its outer shell, okay? So in order to get connected, all right, here's another. It shares a bond right here, okay? So this is hydrogen. What hydrogen is sharing with oxygen, okay? And this is a covalent bond because it is sharing electrons, okay? The oxygen atom carries 6 electrons in its outermost shell and wants to get to the number 8 total on the outside shell to be noble. Remember, it has to feel like neon, okay? So because the hydrogen atom only has 1 electron in its valence shell, it shares 1 electron with oxygen to help complete oxygen outer orbital shell. And because the hydrogen willingness to share its electron with oxygen makes it feel like a noble gas, it creates a stable bond between them both. In this instance, sharing is caring, right? So the reality is that sometimes there is a greater purpose in our life. And if we're willing to share the one thing we may have to attract something much bigger, The one thing that brings you closer together to form that bond may be one's feeling of completion and can create a stable relationship based off the shared experience. In order for the two to become one, we must share something that wouldn't cause us any pain to do so. That way, nothing is lost while everything is to be gained, such as a stable relationship. Now, instead of being bonded to the one thing being shared, you are now invested in a relationship which establishes a stronger bond. Self-fulfillment in a stable relationship forms a strong bond that everyone wants to be a part of. So nobody wants to be left out. With the formation of this bond, you will attract others with the principle of sharing. With that, you can build upon that and end up with a collection of other like-minded organisms that share that same philosophy. In return, you can end up with a positive outlook determined by the chemistry principles of the first covalent bond. Now, the oxygen has a greater number of electrons and more mass than the hydrogen atom, so the gravitational strength pulls it naturally because it's greater and causes the hydrogen to stick to the oxygen. In this process of forming one bond, another type of bond is created. Okay? So remember the phrase, there's strength in numbers, and you can't have one without the other. Okay? So that covalent bond allows for another bonding relationship to occur, which is called a polar covalent bond. All right? So I'm going to show you what a polar covalent bond is. So because you have this being negative, and now because it's sharing this negative charge right here, right? This leaves a slight positive to hydrogen, okay? Because remember, all atoms start out as neutral, okay? So because it's sharing this negative charge and it has more electrons, it is pulling more, it has more of a greed for the electrons, okay? So these are what leaves this positive, and this is slightly negative, more negative, okay? So now you have a polar covalent bond right there, okay? So that covalent bond causes a polar covalent bond, and which I'm going to explain later is going to connect you to a hydrogen bond, okay? When something is polar, it has a positive and negative pole. The polar bond represents the positive and negative charge of the atom. Because the hydrogen is pulled in due to the gravitational strength of the oxygen's need for the electrons, means that the hydrogen's electrons that is shared spends most of its time in the orbital shell of the oxygen. This creates a negative charge around the oxygen, leaving a slight positive charge around the hydrogen atom. The results of the hydrogen shared its negative charge with the oxygen and receives a slightly charged positive outlook. Okay? So understanding in chemistry, when we spend most of our time bonding to a person or a thing, it can change our chemical properties, the way people see us, or basically our polarity, right? It changes our pole, or how we get looked at. Depending on what's being shared determines the charge of your polarity. So this effect can create either a positive or negative experience due to the strength of the polarity. That bond that pulls us in closer and changes our charge can change our life and our world. Because of the polarity being displayed will attract the kind of people / atoms that you either want to or don't want to be around. Always remember, opposites attract, and because they attract, an atom wants to be stable and uses that opposite charge of another atom / molecule to become balanced. So based on how you deal with it determines your outcome of which you will attract next. This polar covalent bond creates the formation of the hydrogen bond, which connects water molecules to each other. Okay? So now this is where it all comes together. And when I say it all comes together, I do mean pun intended. The molecule of water, positively charged hydrogen atom, forms a bond to a negatively charged oxygen atom of a different water molecule. So you can see here, each water molecule is connected to the negative of another. Okay, so you have the negative poles and the negative polarity of the oxygen and the positive charge of the hydrogen. And that's how water molecules actually bond and stick together. Okay? The principle opposite attract is expressed here and represented the duality of mankind. all right, because we all have multiple different poles to us, all right, and how we connect to one another. There are two sides to every person, and some manages it well, and others don't manage it so good, okay. But those that manage it well usually don't have a problem getting along with others because the mood in their pole can be easily identified. See, when we can identify the pole, then we can know the charge to apply to help stabilize the matter. Okay? So, if we know how to relate, then there's a relationship. But when the polarity is too drastic and too unpredictable, then we label it as bipolar. Okay? So remember, atoms start off as neutral, so their polarity can be easily identified. But when a person is bipolar, it's hard to determine their mood because the inconsistency of their polarizing behavior, which make it difficult for them and difficult for others to be able to read, right, and establish a stable connection between them. So each one of us tries to balance our polarity to a different degree every single day. Okay, that's a part of life. Usually, these poles are acknowledged through good behavior and bad behavior. Okay, good being the positive side of things and bad being the negative. But when we strongly disagree with one side of the pole, we're in need of the opposite charge to keep us stable. This is called a positive or negative reinforcement. So our pole of polarity shows others whether we need a positive or negative charge to neutralize the output. Too much of a good thing gets us feeling high and mighty, and there's a need to be humble. Too low causes grief and depression, and we can all use some words of encouragement to help pick us up. So an example of the rule would be if a person was to lose someone that they love, we instantly want to console them because we understand that there's a need for positive reinforcement. If a person begins to brag or boast too much, then we quickly want to remind them, of their faults so we can be able to put them back into their place and give them a level head. This is where the true expression of the term real friend comes to mind. Someone who can pick you up when you need it, and someone who can put you back in your place and bring you back down when you're too boastful. When the two become one, we'll establish a balance or homeostasis within the mind and body, and will help the bonding relationship of those around us. We are not all meant to be the same at the same time, but we all are required to work together as one sound mind and body. So because the molecules of water establishes its strength in numbers through the polar bonds that bind them, makes it a universal solvent of life. Based on this, it creates a property known as cohesion. Okay? A cohesive force of water means that it bonds strongly to itself, meaning other like molecules of water. Water has the highest cohesiveness of any non-metallic liquid. So you may ask to yourself, why is this important? And the results of this cohesiveness creates what is called surface tension and adhesion. Okay? Surface tension is when the water molecules will bond tightly together on the water surface to adhere to the surface material that it may come in contact with. Okay? So, as a result, you can see on the demonstration that water molecules will bond tightly to itself more so than the surface of the air above it, right? So this is where you get your pools and your lakes and so forth. And as you can kind of see, most of the time when you're floating on top of the water, that water, that top layer is what allows you to float, or you got some bugs that walk on the top of that water. They're walking on the surface tension of the water. Okay, so the top layer is very tightly bonded, but the bottom layer, right, as soon as you break that surface tension, the water molecules freely move around. Okay, because they're being pulled in every which direction versus just that top layer, which are being pulled together. Okay, so a result of what I'm talking about would be how water molecules bead up and move together across the surface like wax paper, for instance, right? So as you can tell from the surface of wax paper, water beads up together and they hold tightly to itself versus tightly to the wax paper. Okay, or you don't see it spread out all amongst the wax paper. Same thing in Teflon, right? Okay. So to go ahead and describe a little bit more of what we're talking about as far as water molecules sticking together, we're going to use an example of the rule. Do you agree with President Trump in office? See, so a large amount of people would probably move to the side of the same direction saying no, right? Surface details can inspire a reaction from people to get the people to move together against an opposition. Kind of like when you're going to war. Can't go to war without the strength of the people backing the cause. The people bond is stronger together when they agree collectively. After all, isn't this how the laws are supposed to get passed, right? So the power of the people is here and is needed collectively to agree to advance society and to evolve our world as we know it. Okay? Adhesion. All right? So adhesion is when the molecules of water likes to stick to the surface of a non-water-like material. So if you pour water onto a glass surface, you can watch it spread out, all right, as opposed to that wax paper. Or you can witness this when you pour water into a glass, or you drink from your glass, and you can see the water cling to the side of the bottle instead of sliding back down into the pool, right, of water at the base. And you'll notice this also when it dries up, it creates water spots. Okay, so those are some facets of adhesion. Okay. Example of the rule would be how surface details create surface tension that can lead a person's belief or follow someone else's. People are led to believe, and those who lead inspire others to follow. Our beliefs are based on a surface details because we choose to adhere to certain principles or theories without our own in-depth research of the information. And even with our own research, knowledge is circumstantial, based off of the source of where it came from and the level of experience in the matter. So in the case of the source of political points of views and religion, can leave the people spread out in different directions to form separate ideas and opinions based on how they adhere to the surface details of the information presented, which is how cliques of people and organizations get formed. Adherence to what we like as individuals can cause us to spread out from the group mentality, which will leave a weaker and more vulnerable bond for a moment. Okay? And by this, when I say by the moment, it spreads us out from the group. So it has a positive because you're forced to think differently from what the group actually thinks. But anytime you spread apart from the group, it does leave you weaker for the moment. Okay? Until you collectively gather enough people, enough resources. Okay? So water collects and gathers in the middle where it finds rest. So in due time, a puddle can become a pool, and a pool can become a pond, and a pond to a lake. So, if not by now, and if you fail to catch the message yet, keep listening, and you're bound to bond or stick to or adhere to the information that's presented. Okay? Birds of a feather flock together. This is such a beautiful phrase because it represents no matter how weak a bond is, there's always a degree of strength in numbers. So, us as atoms are made up of molecules of H2O. We inherit the traits of water, like bonding to other substances. Often our bonds to one another are weak, and we allow other things to get in the way and get in between the collective bonds to one another. When a substance is denser and carries a greater polarity than the water, it breaks up the hydrogen bonds, causing the water molecules to separate from one another. The substance is known as hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means that the water likes the substance, and the substance can be dissolved by the water. So when I say in the case of presented by this would be more so like salt water. Okay? In the case of salt water, the polarity of charge of particles is greater than the water molecules, So the elements separate in water. The water molecules surround those charged particles of salt crystals called ions, which will be described in the next video, all right, and through ionic bondings. But ions are causes it to be dissolved in salt, okay? In water. Charged particles found in water conducts electricity known as electrolytes, okay? So, salt and sugar can both be dissolved in water, but because they bond differently to the water molecules creates different reactions. Okay, so in the case of salt, salt conducts electricity. Okay, minerals conduct electricity. So as you can find out, when you put electrodes into mineralized water, salt water, you can see that it connects electricity. Your brain operates with those types of salts and minerals in it, right? Okay, so remember, your brain is 85% water. So we know it needs to be in there for it to conduct electricity. Okay? Sugar takes away and dims the light. And you can also find this out if you go ahead and Google and do your research and YouTube what salt water does and sugar water does to a light bulb. Okay? So, sugar forms another covalent bond with water, whereas salt and other minerals form an ionic bond. And an ionic bond with water, which is essential to conduct electrolytes. Okay, this is where those terms where everybody's craving about and raving about electrolytes more so. Salt and sugar are both hydrophilic and can be dissolved by water, but create a different chemical reaction by changing the structure of water. Our example of the rule would be radio or television, as they possess a greater polarizing effect to influence the chemical change in the bonding of people. And as people gather around the TV or radio, as molecules of water gather around salt and sugar crystals to dissolve its content, depending on the substance of the content determines the chemical structure of the water, whether it creates a problem or a solution for the people. Remember, the chemical bond of the collective audience is the people who represent the molecules of water. The solute is the substance dissolved in the water. The polar charge comes from the TV or the radio, and depending on the substance of the content, has the power to influence the decision of the hearts and minds of the people. The substance determines the bond of the chemical structure, which in turn creates a chemical effect in the life of how you interact with society. When a substance is hydrophobic, means that it cannot break apart the bonds of the water. Okay? So, in this case, you can see a nonpolar and a polar molecule. Okay, the polar molecule represents the water. Okay, you have the hydrogen bonds on the as the plus, and then the red is your oxygen bond. Okay, and then you have a nonpolar molecule such as oil. Okay, so when a substance lacks a polar charge, it is nonpolar, and there can be no influence or interference between the water. Okay. Example of the rule is when you don't give any interest to a particular matter, meaning that it doesn't move you emotionally or physically either way. This means that the material substance is non-polar or a non-issue. Polarity works like this. We are all atoms of energy, so whatever provides a charge, whether it be negative or positive, has the ability to move us in a direction to be positive or negative. But if something is a non-polar or is a non-matter, we could care less about it. Okay, we could care less about the substance of the material trying to divide us. So, in conclusion, together we stand, and divided we dissolve. Okay, and that is the presentation of this YouTube video about water bonds.